I can see there are a good number of participants, and I understand most of them are pursuing PhD, or some of them must have completed your PhD as well. Uh, what are the backgrounds of the participants? Can you just tell me in brief any because from which discipline they have joined this session?
Okay,
Most
yes, sir. Sure, sir. So I request to two, three participants, please introduce yourself.
uh,
Any two, three participants.
no, just give me the brief idea of the disciplines from which disciplines they have joined.
Sir, most of the participants are here from the social science and humanities background, sir.
Art.
Yes.
Not necessarily confined to one subject like political science also. They are from all social sciences, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. So take care. So let us start this session. That is a discussion on selection of the field. Uh, when you have to do a research, either as a part of your PhD work or as a part of independent research, the first question after selecting the topic comes is, where will you do this study? Unless until it is going to be text-based or theoretical study. In theoretical study, perhaps you don't need to go to the field, you don't need to select the field. But when you go to the field, when you do empirical study, you need to select a field. So the next task after selection of the subject is to select the field where you are going to do your study. When you select the subject, you also keep in mind that where are you going to start this topic. So in a way, both are interrelated as well. It's not that one is independent of the other. So once you make a choice of your subject, then you also in a way make a choice of your field as well. Sometimes in theoretical studies also you select the field. It's not that theoretical studies are devoid of any field. There is a particular society, there is a particular country, there is a particular area where you want to study, where people have a study and they have come up with their own theorization of the findings of the problem. So in all the studies, except a very, we can say that philosophical kind of a study, there is a need for selecting the field. That means where are you going to study? What is the area where you are going to study? Is it a society? Is it a country? Is it a region? Is it a state? Is it a district? Is it a village? Is it individual? Is it particular profession? All these come under the purview of selection of the field. So when you have to select the field, there are multiple considerations which you take into account. But before selecting the field, among all the considerations, there are two very important considerations. And those considerations relate to what we call in research methodology epistemological consideration. That is defined in terms of objectivity and subjectivity. You must have read in your papers, in your studies on research methodology, what do you mean by objectivity and what do you mean by subjectivity? In social sciences, there has been debate on this topic. What constitutes objectivity, what constitutes subjectivity, and to what extent social science research could be objective, to what extent it could be subjective. Many of the scholars who have pursued their MA, Master in Political Science, they must have read about behavioral revolutions. So is in other discipline. Post Second World War from 1960, we can say, from 1960 onwards, there has been great emphasis on empiricism in social science as a whole. And this great emphasis on empiricism emanates from the consideration that social science could be as scientific as natural sciences. This triggered a debate in discipline that whether social science could be scientific, whether social science could be objective, and then there have been arguments against objectivity, argument against argument in favor of subjectivity. So both considerations prevail. Both during the discussion of this objectivity subjectivity in 60 onwards, opinion was divided. To some scholars, uh, social scientists, social science can't be purely objective as we get into natural sciences. But at the same time, they also argue that social science to some extent can be equally objective. A counter argument emanates from this discussion, that is that since social science deals with human beings and social scientists who deal with human being, both are human being, both cannot be observed like an object in a laboratory or an experimental object in a laboratory. So when we try our level best to become objective, we are born to be subjective because our own value system, our own preference, our own knowledge, our own culture somehow come in the way of our study of the other of the society. So this debate was there in 60. Nonetheless, there was a great deal of literature which were mostly empirical study based, in which scholars went to the field, scholars collected large amount of data, analyzed the data, interpreted this data, and come out with various findings, including some theorization as well. Before 1960, the emphasis was not so much on empiricism, particularly in social sciences. It was more in terms of like theorization of some problem, but not necessarily too much emphasis on going to the field, collecting data, a lot of empiricism. That is a post Second World War phenomenon, in particular from 1960 onwards. So when this debate occurred in 60, later on, even 70, up to 70, because from 1980 there was an counter argument that social science can't be purely objective like natural sciences. So this objectivity subjectivity debate emanates from the concern to what extent social science research could be as objective or as scientific as natural sciences research. For example, when we compare two disciplines, social science and natural sciences, two domains rather, I'd say. In natural sciences, most of the things are predictable. Since we deal with an object, for example, we very simple formula is about the formation of water H2O. Two, when we mix two atom of hydrogen with one atom of oxygen, it is bound to create water in whatever conditions we mix it. But same kind of things we can't predict, we can't say about human society. Say for example, you must have recently read the elections result of Haryana State Assembly. So of Jammu and Kashmir. Most of the psephologists told about Haryana election that it's going to be, it's kind of Congress is going to get the majority of the seats. But when the result came out, the reverse was there. Perhaps the reason is being that the psychologists or those who study the people behavior, they couldn't assess properly whether they are going to vote for the Congress or whether they are going to vote for the BJP. So, with waste of their efforts, the results came out wrong. But in natural sciences, whether you mix H2O at Haryana or you mix H2O at Jammu and Kashmir or Madhya Pradesh, the result will be same there. So natural sciences, there is an element of predictability, there is an element of certainty, there is an element of definition, a definitive. But in social sciences, we don't have those elements. We can't predict things the way it may unfold. To some extent, we can make an assessment, can make an observation, but whether this will happen according to our assessment or observation, that we are not sure about that because we deal with human subject. Similarly, in social sciences, there is nothing like certainty. We can't be very definitive about any phenomenon that this will happen. As I gave you example of Haryana result, that most of the psychologists went wrong because they did not read the mind of the people the way they voted for during these elections. So we didn't say for certainty. So our certainty or the element of certainty was not there because we were dealing with human being who has his own elements of choice and preference, and hence social science can't be purely objective. This was the kind of counter argument given by some scholars who said that social science uh, has some element of subjectivity which can't be ruled out completely. Howsoever empirical our study is, howsoever our study is data based. So this objectivity subjective debate also leads to another level of debate, that is which society to study, our society or other society. Most of you must have chosen some topic, and I just making a kind of guess from here that I have seen and I have based on some observations that most of the scholars prefer to study their own society. They say if somebody belongs to Uttar Pradesh, he said that he will study something like Uttar Pradesh. Somebody is from Assam, he will study Assam. Somebody is from Maharashtra, will try to study Maharashtra. This tendency has come in a great way in our university, particularly PhD research. But this should not be the case. Rather, one should see the other society as well. Nonetheless, the point which needs to be emphasized is that when you have to select the field, this selection of the field is largely your choice, your preference, and sometimes be without applying proper consideration, scientific consideration, you select the field. When you select your own society based on some scientific considerations, then perhaps there is nothing wrong in that. But when you select a society simply because you belong to that society, then and there is no scientific consideration for selecting the society, then perhaps this is not a wrong methodological approach to selecting the field. So from objectivity and subjectivity, the debate goes on to another level of discussion, that is selection of the field, whether one should study our society, that means whether one should study own society or whether one should study other society. By own society and other society, there is not a very rigid distinction between our society and the society, but broadly be defined in terms of society to which usually I belong to, another society to which usually I do not belong to. In a way, suppose that I belong to a particular state, I belong to a particular community, I belong to a particular caste, I belong to a particular group of population, then I if I choose that group, that caste, that community, that region, then in a way we can say that this is our society. Selection of the field is our society. But opposite is that when we go to select a field, go to select a person or a group of people or a caste or a community or a state to which I do not directly belong, in that case we can say it is an other society. That means the society to which I am not belonging is other society. Society to which I am belonging is own society. Sometimes, particularly in modern times, it becomes very difficult to say about our society and other society. Nonetheless, this broad distinction we can keep in mind, that to which society we are going to study, whether we are going to study our society, we are going to study other society. When we have to select the topic in terms of when we have to select the field in terms of our society and the society, the most important considerations which we have to keep in mind from social science methodological perspective is that to what extent our study and our selection of our society will permit objectivity in our research. In other words, to what extent, even we select our own society, we will be objective. That means objectivity of the study, objectivity of the research will not be lost simply because we are going to study our own society. At the same time, when we are going to study other society, then again we have to take into consideration to what extent we will be objective to other society. That means the way we see the things, we will interpret accordingly. We will not impute our judgment, our value, or our own preference. I give you one example. For example, when you go to study tribal society, or you go to study some society in which consumption of liquor is a very prevalent thing, and it is a customary part of the society. It is a custom of the society. They have been consuming liquor for century, which is very much part of their life, not only individual life but also of their social life. They celebrate festivals with liquor consumption. They every day they have the consumption of liquor. Now suppose that when we go to study that society, not being to that society, and when we see this phenomenon of that everybody is consuming liquor, and if we are not liquor consuming society, if I do not belong to liquor consuming society, that means if I am teetotaler, in that case, my first observation will be, which naturally happens, is that this society it consumes liquor, and this leads to some kind of problem in society. Now, this kind of observation itself is problematic because I have seen that society, or I'm going to see the society from my own lens. That means I have, in a way, imposed my subjectivity, my value preference on that society. That should not be the case even we go to study other society. That means when we select the field, whether it is our society, whether it is other society, we must give consideration to the dominant, to the most important consideration of objectivity and subjectivity. By objectivity, we mean we observe the way the things are there. By subjectivity, we mean that we do not observe the things the way they are, rather, we observe the way I have seen it, the way I have imputed value on not the observation. As I gave you the example of consumption of liquor in some societies, when somebody who doesn't belong to the society goes to observe the society, then the person, the immediate response, the immediate observation of that person is that the society is liquor, society consumes liquor, and there are many evils related to consumption of liquor. But somebody who belongs to the society and studies his own society, he will not give attention to this problem at all, because he knows that this is a part of their custom, this is part of their daily life, this is part of their social life. So consuming liquor is not taboo in the society, but it is something taboo in the society. Similarly, there are various other examples of studying our society and other societies in which this often comes into consideration, to what extent we are objective, we are, or to what extent we are subjective. But as an independent researcher, as a social scientist, when we go to study whether our own society or whether we go to study other society, we must keep in mind that we should try to be objective in terms of observing the phenomenon which we are observing there. That means that we should not impute our own value. We should not impute our own moral on the other society. We should not go for any kind of value judgment because of something phenomenon which happens in that society, but that doesn't happen in our society. So that ensures to some extent objectivity of observations when we go to a study, whether we go to our own society or we go to study other society. I gave you the example of the tendency that most of the scholars choose their own society, but this is not a very correct approach of selecting the field, because the field should be selected purely on the basis of merit of the subject, merit of the topic, and merit or methodological consideration, not on the consideration that I belong to that society. But sometimes when we belong to the society, the danger which I was discussing very often comes there. So we have to keep in mind. Now, when it comes to this question of our society and the society, then also there is some kind of consideration about the different subjects or different domain. Some in under some subject, some discipline we can say, or under some subject, uh, there is a very some kind of rather a strict rule to not to prefer our own society, but this rule doesn't prevail in other discipline, other domain. For example, in anthropology, most of anthropologists have studied other society. It's not very strict, rigid rule about that, but they tend to study other society, largely because anthropological studies are of particular type of society, and most of the society, most of the scholars who later on turn out to be anthropologists belong to other society, or rather we can say to a more advanced, in modern terms, more advanced society. This doesn't mean that the society or the tribal society or the other society which they are going to study. In the backward society, they have their own level of development, they have own understanding of development. Nonetheless, when somebody goes from outside, then this outsider considers himself to be more modern, more developed, and then he goes to study the tribal society or other society, mostly from anthropological perspective, considering them to be a kind of rather low in terms of modern development concept. So there are preference according to the discipline, according to the subject which you have chosen. As I gave you the example of anthropology, in anthropology, invariably most of the scholars have studied other society. They have not studied their own society because they consider that their own societies have fairly grown up, fairly become modernized. So they should study society which is still rather not outside primitive, but a study which has not become part of the mainstream society or in a way modern society. But when it comes to selecting field in other subjects, say for example sociology, again there are examples of both types of cases. Some scholars have studied their own society, some scholars have studied their own society, other society. There is not a hard and fast rule about that, but on various considerations they have chosen to study their own society. But there are scholars who have studied other society, and in fact there is a very clear colonial division as well, that colonizers and those who had made much progress in modern sense or modern times, say for example Western European society, American society, they very often they have studied other society. They have studied their own society as well, but they have shown much more interest in other society. They have come to India, they have gone to Africa, they have gone to Latin America, and they have gone to Southeast Asian countries, and they have studied other society. Because of this kind of a kind of colonial uh, uh, division, that they consider this society to be rather backward, lacking in development, and more appropriate subject of development because they consider their own society more developed, much more developed. So they prefer to study other society than to their own society. That doesn't mean they don't study their own society, but a large number of them uh, have spread out to other society, to other parts of the world to make a study of the society, whether it is African society, Latin American society, South Asian society, or Southeast Asian society, or even East Asian society, Arab societies from Middle East or Arab countries. They have done so. But even our scholars, many of our own scholars, have preferred to study our own society. And in fact, there is a kind of, we can say, a kind of colonialism some in a scholarship, that most of the scholars from the developing country prefer to study their own society, and they don't go to study Western and developed society, because Western developed society scholars, they say that why to study our society? We have already studied our own society sufficiently. Why need to study your own society, which have lots many problems than our society have? And even they tend to study our society, considering our society to be rather backward, rather in the process of developing and more suitable study material than they consider their own society. That in a way it's kind of a continuation of colonialization of knowledge production, that Western scholars tend to study not their own society. They do a study, but mostly their other society, whereas scholars from the erstwhile colonial countries prefer to study their own society, and don't they go to study the developed and Western societies. That in a way indicates of some kind of a kind of mindset which makes one to even say that it's kind of colonization of knowledge production and some kind of division at the level of knowledge production as well. So, in sociology, there has been tradition of studying our society as well as other society. In contrast to anthropology, where most of the scholars have preferred to study other society, not own society. But in sociology, in fact, some of the great theorists, great theorists, whether it is Durkheim or Max Weber, they have studied first their own society, and then they have gone to study other society. You must have heard about Durkheim, his famous study of suicide, and it was French society. He belongs to France, and it was a French society which was facing the problem of large number of people committing suicide, which led Durkheim to study that what was the reason for so many people committing suicide in French society. And French society is very closely knit society. It's cohesive society. It considers social solidarity as the most important pillar of social structure. And in that situation, if people were committing suicide, that led Durkheim to study the phenomenon of suicide in French society, which led to a very interesting theorization of the phenomenon of suicide by Durkheim. And what he said is that because those people who committed suicide, they were not fully integrated with society, or that in a way we can say that they were alienated from the society, that led them to commit suicide. And this formulation of Durkheim is equally applicable to many other incidences of suicide. And in a way we can say that it is also a theory to understand the phenomenon of society in the society. But Durkheim studied his own society. So did Max Weber, the famous sociologist who studies Western society. Western society, for his famous study, is capitalism, the rise of capitalism in Western European countries, and he relates it with the Protestant ethics and argues that in Protestant ethics there is a restriction on say consumption beyond a point, or lavish consumption. It encourages people to save money. It encourages people to live a frugal life, to live a disciplined life, and that resulted in saving
हेलो
of capital which was invested by those
हाँ
people
आओगे आज
for the development of the society, and that led to industrialization in Western Europe first because of
बात
this
नेटवर्क
kind
में
of
नहीं नहीं था
value and culture which was prevalent in the society. So, in a way, Max Weber argued that Protestant
वो सब
ethics,
सेकंड मीटिंग में
which
हो सकता है अभी
promoted
कोई नहीं
some kind of frugal life, some kind of disciplined life, that resulted in savings, and that savings became capital, and that capital was finally invested in industry,
कितने बजे
which
आओगे
led to
उस टाइम पे
industrialization
स्पेसिफिक और
and
नए आना
growth
हो तो
of
टाइम बता
capitalism
देना क्योंकि
in
मेरा बहुत ही इंगेज टाइम
Western
रहता है
Europe
कभी
and
कभी
Western
लगता है 2 घंटा पूरा
society.
चला गया ऐसे ही
So in a way, Max Weber also studied his own society, not other society. But Max Weber also studies other society,
हाँ
not
वही तो तुमसे पूछ रहा हूँ ना
intensively,
स्पेसिफिक टाइम
but to some extent he has studied other society also. For
3 बजे
example,
आ
he has
जाओगे ना
some understanding of Indian caste system. He made some interesting observation about Indian caste system. But his
चलो ठीक
his important studies was mainly of his own society. In the subject of political science, for example, this urban society and the society, this division is rather fluid in a way because this political phenomenon one observes in a way as an outsider because when I'm not the voter, I'm going to study. When I'm going to suppose my political behavior, then I'm not going to study myself. I'm going to study somebody else who's voting behavior, and then immediately it becomes a kind of other society, not necessarily even one society begin because somebody, the person who belongs to who is going to vote, he has own understanding of the subject. So in a way, even though in terms of caste and community, he might belong to my own caste and community, but in a way he belongs to other because his political behavior is going to be governed more by his political preference and choice than by the social consideration or than by his position in society sometimes. So, but nonetheless, in the subject, what we see that there is again tendency to study our society and other society. Some scholars have studied our own society. Some scholars have studied other society. For example, why is it that most of the Western scholars have taken a lot of interest in Indian democracy, Indian election process, Indian voting behavior, and they have produced very interesting studies of Indian elections, Indian democracy. So has been the case of other scholars, but very few Indian scholars have gone to study American society, American elections, or European elections, or elections in France or Germany, unless until somebody had gone there to do PhD and was making a study of any particular elections or any particular political phenomenon in that society. But by and large, the tendency is that even Indian scholars they have studied the political phenomenon mostly belonging to our own society, our own society. But Western scholars have also have studied other society in great number. So again, there is some kind of this we can say a kind of a split between native scholars and outside scholars. Native scholars prefer to study our own society, whereas outside scholars prefer to study other society. So in political science also this tendency is there, and again there is some kind of division between active and outside scholars. In history, it's not necessarily our society, another society. This division becomes redundant in history unless until we are studying very recent past in the history. For example, if we have to study ancient history, then our society and the society, the question itself is redundant because the society which doesn't exist doesn't belong to either me or to somebody else. So in that case, this boundary gets blurred, and it becomes this whole question becomes irrelevant in the study of history when we are going to study a particular, say for example, civilization which is very old, a particular phenomenon which is very old. But when we study very recent past 10 years, that could be also part of the history, but there probably again there is the chance of there is this consideration of our society, the society, because whether we are studying our society or other society. So, in terms of subjects, there have been various kinds of tendencies among various subject scholars of various subjects. Some of them have studied their own society, some of them have studied other society, and again there is a split between native scholars and scholars from outside. Scholars from outside, particularly from the developed country, they tend to study other society also in great number, but our scholars they tend to study mostly our own society, and that seems to be a fairly visible phenomenon in social science researchers in recent years, or even say 40, 50 years back in the past. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of our society studying of our society in the society? Now, there is not a fast, rigid rule about whether one should study one society or whether one should study other society. Depending on the subject, depending on the other considerations, one can choose the our society and the society as well, and it should not to create any challenge in terms of studying our own society of the society. Uh, but nonetheless, there are some advantages and some disadvantages of studying our society and other society which we must keep into consideration. Firstly, let us examine advantages of studying our own society. So, what are the advantages of studying our own society? First thing is that when we go to study our own society, the first advantage is that I have prima facie some knowledge about our own society. That means we know the society to some extent. We know its structure, we know its culture, we know its value system, we know even individuals, we know even behavioral pattern of the society, we know their political behavior, we know their orientation, political orientation, we know many other things, we know their economic structure. So, prima facie, or at the first instance, we have the clear advantage of knowing the society which we are going to study. To a great extent, we know many other things of that society when we go to study our own society. So, one great advantage is that we know the society to a great extent, which otherwise we would have to learn from literature. We have to learn from review of the subject review of the literature. The second advantage of is language, familiarity with the language. Apart from knowing the society, familiarity with the language or knowing the language of the subject which we are going to study is also very important. Sometimes what happens then we you don't know the language, then the communication between the researcher and the respondent gets obstructed, or rather, it's not communicated fully satisfactorily. Sometimes, with the help of translator, we try to get communicated with the respondent, but sometimes the nuance of the meaning is also lost in the process of translation. At the same time, uh, interacting with the respondent through the help of translator or interpreter is not very helpful because it obstructs the communication between the interviewer and the respondent. If you have any experience of interviewing somebody who doesn't on whose language you do not know and you have taken the help of, you could realize that how it's challenging to interview somebody through the help of translator or interpreter. So knowing the language of the society of the respondent group itself is another advantage of studying our own society. Our own society. Thirdly, when you go to study your own society, then you feel more confident, you feel more secure. You don't have any problem about like you don't remain worried about that how the society will respond to you, how the society will receive you, whether society will give you welcome or not, whether society will accept you as a researcher or not, whether society will hostile to these considerations. Uh, uh, you will not be bogged down by these considerations because you know a priori that this society belongs to you. So when you go to the society, society will not be hostile. So that advantage you have. When it comes to a study other society, then what are the advantages of studying the other society? And then we will come to disadvantages. So the main advantage of studying other society is that you go on a clean slate. That means there is nothing written on this slate. You observe everything afresh. You observe the way you see the things. You do not get biased or you do not get affected by your prior knowledge of the subject of the society which you are going to study. So everything you observe, everything you study about the society gives you a fresh insight which you use it without any imposition of your own value system, without getting it contaminated by your own preference or your value or your own kind of considerations. That makes the society greatly advantageous in terms of ensuring that objectivity is to a great extent ensured in that society. A still subjectivity will come that I will discuss later on. So main advantage of studying other society is that from purely methodological perspective, you would be closer to ensuring, or you would be much more closer to ensuring maximum objectivity while you are going to study other society. The second important advantage of studying other society is that when you see other society, many of the phenomenon uh, might strike you as a kind of interesting research finding, research observations. But when you go to study your own society, many of the things might not strike you as a kind of interesting phenomenon. I give you some examples. Say, for example, you must have heard about a famous Hindi poet Surikant Tripathi Nirala. He belongs to Allahabad. He was in Allahabad, and uh, there is a place very close to Allahabad, Mirzapur, where there is a stone and quarrying factories are there, where still a large number of women work and they break a stone which is used for either construction of houses or road. So once he saw them, he got moved by their pathetic conditions, and then he wrote a very beautiful poem on Batodti Patthar. Uh, we also very often we passed by those areas. It's not that we have not passed by such kind of areas. We see many people working on a stone quarry, or many people working on a stone mines, but we don't get moved by their pathetic conditions. So it also depends on the lens of the researcher. But being outsider, when he saw this, then he got struck by their pathetic condition, and that made him to move, or that made him to write about their condition. So is, for example, his famous poem on the Vikhari, or in which he has observed. We must have also observed, and we generally observe that when there is a rag picker, then dogs start walking on that. But frankly speaking, before I read this Nirala poem, I had not observed this phenomenon. Every day we see this, but nobody observes it. Perhaps people just take it for granted. People remain indifferent to this phenomenon. But as a poet, he observed it. So when you go to study the society, then you have a lens, or you can observe something, the phenomenon which perhaps you could not observe while being part of your own society, while you try to study your own society. So another important advantage of studying other society is that many of the things, many of the phenomena which you could observe, perhaps you would have missed out while studying your own society, because you would have considered this as a kind of very usual phenomenon, very usual routine kind of things, and you would not have been moved by this particular phenomenon. So this is another advantage of now, what are the disadvantages of our society and studying our society and other society? Let me explain first a few disadvantages of studying our society, then we will come to disadvantage of studying other society. So, what are the disadvantages of studying our society? The first thing is, which I mentioned in the beginning also, that objectivity, it becomes difficult to maintain objectivity while you go to study your own society. And I gave you the example. I gave you the example that consumption of liquor. Somebody who belongs to a society which consume liquors as a part of their custom, as a part of their social value system, as a part of their daily consumption uh, 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 quota, for that person, consuming liquor is not something unacceptable. It's not something which needs to be highlighted in the study. But when we go to study that society, and when I belong, or when I am a teetotaler, then I find that a kind of a striking phenomenon, and I might observe that as an important factor. For example, I can illustrate it with the example of study of poverty. For example, let us take the example of poverty. Somebody has gone to study society, a poor society, and the poor society has the habit of consuming liquor. Very often, the researchers comes out and say that this because they spend a lot of money on consumption of liquor. Now, somebody from that society studies the reason for poverty of his own society, then perhaps he would not come up with the finding that consumption of liquor is the primary, or perhaps the most important reason for their poor or their poverty level. So, belonging to the particular society or belonging to other society also affects the length of your observations. So that is the great disadvantage of studying our own society. That sometimes it becomes very difficult to keep yourself fully objective, even though you try to do so. For example, you must have heard about our famous Indian sociologist M.S. Srinivas, who studied the Kurd society, where he studies Kurd village, and then he propounded the theory of Sanskritization and Westernization. Now, Sanskritization, the theory of Sanskritization, uh, is based on the observation which he saw in Kurd village, where lower caste people try to follow the custom, traditions, value, and try to behave like the upper caste, try to follow their clothes, try to follow their housing pattern, try to follow their social custom and traditions. They basically emulate the upper caste, which he termed as a phenomenon of Sanskritization. that they also want to systematize them as upper caste. Now, this observation was to a great extent influenced by his own position in society. He belonged to upper caste Brahmin upper caste, and for that one, perhaps he considered that the lower castes are emulating the norms, values, and social customs and traditions of upper caste. Had perhaps it's kind of hypothetical question which I'm posing, that had he belonged to Dalit perhaps and had he studied Kul, perhaps he would have come out with different kind of a study, different kind of theorization. So in a way, the position of the scholar affects your observation, affects your finding, and which sometimes makes your objectivity a bit compromised while you go to study your own society. Now, in case of Mr. Mas, we can't say that his objectivity was compromised. In any case, he came out with very interesting finding, very interesting theorization of social change phenomenon in society. But there is an argument there one can think about this topic, that had he belonged to other caste and community, whether his finding would have been the same or similar, or would have been different, or his lens would have gone somewhere else. One position in society affects your objectivity. So a major challenge of studying our own society is how to maintain your objectivity. Uh, uh, Opposite is the case in studying the other society. While you study other society, then we fairly assume that you will not be or you will not impose your own preference, your own value system. So in a way, we can say that it will not be subjective. But while you study your own society, you remain to the best. Even you make your best effort to remain objective. You try to become subjective to some extent, because you are also part of the same society. So objectivity and subjectivity, one has advantage, another has disadvantage. While you study our own society, then you have advantage of access, we have advantage of language, we have advantage of confidence, but objectivity is compromised, or objectivity could be compromised. But while you study other society, you have advantage of being objective, but there are other challenges of studying other society. The important challenges include challenge of language barrier, challenge of understanding many of the customs and traditions, the way they are practiced with the people of that society. It takes time to get familiar with those customs and traditions. It all depends on your contact period with your subject matter or the study group. If your contact period is very short duration, say 2 months, 3 months, then perhaps you may not get yourself familiar with many of the practices, and then you might come out with the findings which could not be appropriate as well. So your contact period with the subject group, with your study group, is equally very important, and it also helps you in terms of ensuring that to what extent you have been able to understand other society. The third advantage and disadvantage with both our society and other society is that doing research itself, that means accessibility, that means acceptance, that means confidence level. When you go to study your own society, then you don't have the problem or don't have the challenge of being acceptable there, or you're not going to be hostile, or you're not going to meet hostile people there, or people are not hostile, who are not hostile to you. Thirdly, you feel more confident that you know the society, you feel some kind of affinity with the society, so the acceptance level will also be relatively higher. But when you go to study at the society, then you have such kind of challenges, whether you will be accepted or not, whether people will remain friendly to you or not, whether people will whether in the process of a study, sometimes what happens in the process of studying other society, because we don't know many of the things, we also heard their sentiment, and we heard their customs, traditions, or some sentiments which make them sometimes very hostile, and sometimes they become even ask you to leave the field. So both our society and the society have advantages and disadvantages. Uh, the final conclusion, which is that, first of all, when we select a subject, then the next consideration is that where is the field and what is the field which I'm going to study. So selection of the subject and then selection of the field, both are interrelated. But once we select the subject, the next question comes to us is where is the field which I'm going to study? And the field doesn't mean only the field means a group of people. Field means a village, a group of village, or one village, a group of village, a community, a particular place, a region, could be a state, it could be country also, that could be the world also, and many countries could also be the field of study. So once we select this our field, then our main consideration is about objectivity and subjectivity, because that is important methodological consideration. To what extent selection of the field will ensure that my study will not be contaminated by any kind of subjectivity, or my study will remain scientific, will study will remain as objective as possible. And for both studying of both the society, whether we study our society or whether we study other society, there are advantages and disadvantages. Our society have some advantages in terms of like knowing the field, knowing the subject, in terms of language, in terms of being acceptable, being accessible, and friendly people. Other society, we have some advantages that we can be as objective as possible, because we see the phenomenon as they are. The second advantage of the society is that we can observe some of the things which perhaps we might have not observed while studying our own society, because the things are and the things appear peculiar to or something very different from our society, and that makes you to take note of the phenomenon that observations have. And thirdly, disadvantage of other society is that apart from these two advantages, the main advantage of other society is that main disadvantage of the society is that you have to ensure that how you conduct the field. That means the challenges of conducting field in the society are greater than challenges of conducting field in our own society. So even though these considerations are there, finally the final consideration will be that our study, whichever study we do, should not be contaminated by any kind of or contaminated by our own uh, prior positions, our predisposition, our value system, our views about the society. That means when we go to a study, whether we study our society or whether we study other society, we should try to remain as scientific as possible, as objective as possible. And for that matter, there are various tools, there are various principles which we follow when we go to a study, whether we go to study our society or whether we go to study other society. And there have been examples from different disciplines of people studying both kinds of society. People have studied their own society, people have studied their other society. It all depends on how you have studied, whether you have studied your own society or the society, how you have observed the phenomenon. That makes your findings interesting, findings appealing, and findings of long-term relevance. So it ultimately depends on the researcher how he pursues his study. But one should always keep in mind that there are some methodological tools, some methodological considerations which we should wear while we go to the field, and there are practices, there are methodological practices through which we can ensure balance between objectivity and subjectivity, whether we study our society or we study other society. So I will stop here, and then we can have questions and answers, clarifications and doubts, since I can see a large number of participants are there, and I prefer your questions answering the query or giving answer to your query. Thank you so much. Please, you can now raise questions. Let me just remove some ad is coming on my side is screen.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sure, sir.
Now, because
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay, so thank you so much, sir, for your excellent lectures on the selection of the field, our societies and other societies. So, in this regards, any participants have any queries, doubts, and questions, so you can ask directly to respected Dr. Ashok Pankaj, sir. So, with your introduction. So, thank you so much. Anyone, you can ask the question and discuss. Thank you so much. My voice is coming.
I can hear you.
Okay,
Because
okay, okay. So participants, now session is open. You can ask the questions to sir. Yes. Hello.
मैं सुन रहा हूँ विकास पार्टिसिपेंट को बताइए उनको कोई
Pa-
क्वेश्चन कोई क्वेरी कोई जिज्ञासा है कोई क्यूरियोसिटी है समथिंग व्हिच यू डोंट फील हेजिटेट प्लीज आस्क यू व्हाटएवर
अरे डिलीट करो उसको, अभी क्यों भेज दिए हो? हाँ, पार्टिसिपेंट्स, मेरी आवाज आ रही है? हेलो, मेरी आवाज आ रही है?
Yes, sir. No queries, sir.
Yes, sir.
हाँ, so any
Because your voice is very clear.
okay, any participant? If any,
questions
if
questions make interaction more fruitful or rather it's more useful than the lecture so हाँ बोलिए बोलिए
one minute sir, I think किसी को voice problem है. 1 minute.
अच्छा स्क्रीन पर हैंड भी रेज कर सकते हैं देन वी विल प्रॉम्प्ट यू इफ
हाँ,
यू आर
आप
फेसिंग
लोग लिख भी सकते हैं चैट बॉक्स में.
if you are facing any technical glitch then please raise your hand or you type your question we will try to answer
चलिए सर, आई थिंक कि किसी के पास कोई क्वेश्चन आई थिंक किसी के पास कोई क्वेश्चन नहीं है. यदि किसी का कोई क्वेश्चन हो तो आप लिख सकते हैं, अदरवाइज हम सेशन एंड करने जा रहे हैं.
ठीक है क्वेश्चन नहीं है विकास कैन दे इंट्रोड्यूस देमसेल्व्स do we have time for that we have I would like to know that what they are doing fine no question that's fine but can you introduce yourself what are you doing what subject what topic
Okay,
you have
someone please introduce yourself. Hello, yes.
from which institution which university you have joined
Good morning, sir.
बोलिए
Sir, I'm from education field. My discipline is education. So, in education, when we are going to write a research paper in a definite area like school education or higher education, so then so when I'm going to write a paper on a school education and on a secondary school students. So the students come from the different societal background and they have a different experiences from they have different experiences from their upbringings and other experiences. So when we find some result when from the data collection, then we are normally going to generalize this data. So please suggest us how we find their societal background on that findings, the role of the society and their upbringings in their education.
आपने क्या जनरलाइजेशन किया है इसमें कुछ? Can you tell me about your generalization? What you have generalized based on the finding? Where have you studied this school education? Which place?
Yes, sir. Sir, I'm from BHU, Faculty of Education. So, sir, we are doing a research. Sir, I'm just giving an example. Sir, when suppose I'm doing a research on mathematical or scientific awareness of a secondary class student. So, sir, I'm taking a 100 school and from the Varanasi. So, the awareness of the student regarding the scientific literacy or other, so it may affect from their society. It may affect from their society rather than their only school education. It may also affect from their societal background, like some student belong from the rural, some belong from the urban, and or definite class, definite interdisciplinary, basically. We are going to generalize their overall, which we are finding the overall awareness, and and we generalize that all the Varanasi secondary school students have the this much level of the awareness. So, sir, how to find a uh, societal effect?
I got your point. No, you can't actually write in a very generalizing experiences of all the students, because that would be a kind of wrong analysis of the data. If suppose that students belonging to poor family, belonging to rural areas, have lower access to technology, internet, lower access to literature around, and then if you say that about the level of generalization, suppose that if you make a statement about that 50% of the students are know about this scientific phenomenon. Now this 50% of the students are not homogeneous actually. So here there is a problem. You have to break it down in terms of that students from rural areas, students from poor family. They tend to be. I just try making hypothetical argument. So not take it as a kind of the result of. So tend to be less aware of this scientific phenomenon. Then your analysis interpretation will be complete. But don't make a very general analysis, because the group of the a student which you have chosen for a study do not belong to the same society. They belong to different societies, so their experiences could be different. So you must also explain their differential experiences to explain your finding. That can't be generalized.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
ओके, थैंक यू। और किसी का कोई सवाल है?
Sir, one more question.
हाँ, पूछो साक्षी।
Sir, in our research coursework, when we are in a research coursework, sir, we thought about the interdisciplinary researches. So, sir, we thought that how interdisciplinary researchers find out the different aspect of the research. But when we are going to write a paper, research paper, and we limit our research paper in a definite population and with definite sample, when it is not related with the thesis, we are going to do a small size of sample to write a research paper. Then, sir, how interdisciplinary aspect of that work so, help us to in our to enhance the research paper quality.
इंटरडिसिप्लिनरी का कोई बहुत स्ट्रिक्ट उसको डिफाइन करना मुश्किल होता है, बट इंटरडिसिप्लिनरी बेसिकली भी मींस दैट we take the concepts and methods from other discipline also. So it's not necessarily that we confine our method and concept to one particular discipline, and that is interdisciplinary. But to make a study interdisciplinary, one should also one should have the knowledge of the other discipline as well. Otherwise, simply you can't make it interdisciplinary unless until you know the other discipline also. Say, for example, if you know what Durkheim has said, and if you know what political science, for example, Huntington has said, then unless until you know both the persons, then you won't be able to say borrow the concept from both the disciplines. Uh, so for making a study interdisciplinary, you should know the concepts and methods of other discipline. Only then you can make it interdisciplinary. It's not like that by selection of the subject one can make interdisciplinary. But many of the subjects need a kind of interdisciplinary approach, and one has to approach the subject with interdisciplinary framework. Now, for example, education is subject. To study education, you have to apply various concepts and methods from various disciplines. You have to apply from political science. You have to apply from economics as well, because these factors, these are also political factors, economic factors also affected the phenomena of education. So in a way, it is dependent on political conditions, political climate, economic conditions, and for that matter, you should know about the political condition, about economic condition. Only that in that condition you can make your study interdisciplinary in true sense. But writing paper is not necessarily that you have to be interdisciplinary. Paper has its own requirement in terms of legal, in terms of. So, what is the year of your PhD? In which year of PhD you are?
The
second year. By the way, I'm going to study some school in Uttar Pradesh. So I will ask. One of my colleague will contact you. Will there be some students pursuing education will agree to do the field work? There are two districts in Uttar Pradesh. One is Sitapur. One is Badaun. So because can you share her number to me? I will pass on to my colleagues. She will contact you for some PhD scholars to do our field working.
Yes, sir. Sure, sir. Sure.
So, can you speak to some of your classmates who would be interested in doing some field work on school education? It would be around 10 to 12 days of field work. One in Sitapur district, another in Badaun district. Badaun district perhaps we may hire from this side because, but from if somebody is from this side also, we will come. We need 4 students, perhaps 4 to 5 for Uttar Pradesh.
ओके कृति जी
Sure,
आपने
sir.
हाँ कृति जी आपने हैंड रेज किया है, कोई क्वेश्चन आपका? ओके, और आप में से कोई?
हाँ. So one more question.
Only one more question.
So role of intersectionality in research. So what I want to know the role of intersectionality to enhance the research.
Role of intersectionality. What do you want to know in?
So in a research work, like to integrate a different aspect of different aspect of population.
Intersectionality का कोई रोल नहीं होता. Basically, intersectionality is a tool of analysis and interpretation. As I mentioned about this students, now there's a school education which you are pursuing in Banaras. So students belonging to different category, you have to analyze and interpret data according to the position. That will be kind of intersectional explanation of the phenomenon. So the rule is that basically you make your study more nuanced, you make it study more clear, because if you make a very general kind of observation, then perhaps you mix the nuance of the different students belonging to different category. That can be done, taken care of by applying intersectional analysis.
Thank you, sir.
Because so, I think this should conclude here.
yes sir, I think अब हमें end करना चाहिए. So sir, thank you so much sir. और आपका एक्सपीरियंस जो रहा तो हम सब लोगों के लिए बहुत ही लाभान्वित होगा. और मैं बता दूं सर कि कई पुस्तकें हैं जो सेज रूटलेस से आई हैं, और सर ने सबसे ज़्यादा फील्ड स्टडी के बेस पर ही अपने पुस्तकें लिखी हैं, और कई रिसर्च भी सर ने फील्ड स्टडी के बेस पे कंडक्ट किया है. तो सर का जो जब मैंने सर से बात किया तो स्पेशली सर ने फील्ड स्टडी के बारे में क्वेश्चन टॉपिक हमको दिया, और वास्तव में हम सब ने सुना कि आवर सोसाइटी और अदर सोसाइटी में फील्ड स्टडी कौन कौन से आयामों को ध्यान में रख करके की जानी चाहिए. इसमें सर का बहुत ही सारगर्भित व्याख्यान रहा और लेक्चर रहा. वास्तव में सर जितने भी शोधार्थी स्कॉलर्स इसमें जुड़े हुए हैं तो सबके लिए ये बहुत ही लाभान्वित होगा आपका ये उद्बोधन. और सर के कुछ वर्क्स हैं, मैं पहले शुरुआत में इंट्रो करना भूल गया था. अभी रिसेंट ही सर की पुस्तक स्प्रिंजर से पब्लिश्ड हुई है, इंक्लूसिव डेवलपमेंट थ्रू गारंटीड एम्प्लॉयमेंट इंडियाज मनरेगा एक्सपीरियंस. और एक सर की मुझे बहुत ही जो मुझे विशेष रूप से पसंद आई पुस्तक सर की, मैंने प्रिफेस पढ़ा, और सर मैं आपसे ये पुस्तक मंगवाऊंगा, अभी मांगूंगा जब दिल्ली आऊँगा मैं. दलित में सर ने पुस्तक लिखा है, दलित सबल्टर्निटी एंड सोशल चेंज इन इंडिया, एडिटेड बुक है सर की, बहुत ही अच्छी पुस्तक है. तो हम लोग सर को आगे भी सुनेंगे और आगे भी सर को इनवाइट करेंगे लेक्चर्स के लिए. और सर आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद सर, आपने हमारा आमंत्रण स्वीकार किया, टाइम निकाला. तो सर थैंक यू सो मच एंड प्रणाम सर.
Thank you so much. And Vikas, send me the number of Sakshi.
Yes sir, sure sir, sure.
Thank you sir. Raman will contact you, Sakshi. Raman or Purnima, they are my colleagues. They will contact you.
Yes.
You speak to them. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.